There are words that we speak often. Love is one of those words. And the words that we use sometimes lose meaning. Calling is one of those words. We use it in church a lot. I feel called to ministry. I feel a calling in my life. But sometimes we don't hear what that means from people. It can be kind of a mysterious thing to say. I was thinking about that, and this past week my cousin announced that his wife, they announced they were having a baby. And they told the family, and they did something kind of different. They actually recorded the expressions and the faces of people as they told them. And then they made this beautiful video of all of these people basically losing their minds in excitement and joy. And they have the song set behind it, and it's just face after face of love and excitement. And I thought, what a story to tell that baby, that child someday, that before they even came into the world, all of these people were so excited they were going to be here. And that story of love brings love to life. Right? So today I'd like to talk about the story of Samuel. I'm going to talk a little bit about my call story. And then we're also going to have a little bit of time to actually spend time in reflection about our own stories, each of you. The story of Samuel being called that night has always intrigued me. There's something very beautiful about it. This boy who was promised to Hannah, born, weaned, and then brought to the temple in service of God. I imagine that he felt that weight at some point, realizing that his mom was leaving him in the care of Eli to serve God. She would come and visit every year, bring new clothes, bring a sacrifice. And Eli was raised there and learned about the rhythms of the temple. See in the passage, he's opening the doors and getting things ready for the day. And that night, he was just sleeping like he normally did. He heard his name called. I don't know about you, but I have the two young kids who are sitting right next to me. They're 5 and 7 now, and I still get woken up frequently in the middle of the night. It's usually not a good experience for anyone. I startle easily. So usually I start screaming, and then they start screaming because I'm screaming because I scared them. But they're already scared because they had a bad dream. So it just takes a lot of time to get everybody calmed down and back to sleep. And I imagine Eli being startled. Samuel comes, Eli, you called me. Go back to bed, please. I'm tired, I'm old. Stop waking me up. It wasn't me. It happens again. He runs across the stone floor. Eli, I'm here. Nope. And the third time, Eli recognizes what's happening and instructs the boy. And God speaks. And Samuel gets to hear that. And God continues to speak in Samuel's life reliably. I think there's a couple things I wanted to kind of draw out of this story. One is one that I think we may have heard before in Sunday school, which is that God chooses to call a child. And I remember being encouraged as a child that God can work in your life regardless of your age, whether you're very young or very old or anywhere in the middle. This story reminds us of that. I thought it was interesting as I read this time too that Samuel hears the voice and it's gentle enough and familiar enough that he runs to Eli. In other times in Scripture, God speaks and it's a burning bush, or God's presence is a great, huge display. And in this story, perhaps, it's quiet and gentle enough for a child. And I think the third thing is that Eli was thinking about, if one of my children came and I thought maybe they were hearing the voice of God, it would be really hard for me not to kind of saddle up next to them and to kind of see what was happening, or to go into their room with them and be with them, what's happening to the child. But he let Samuel have his own call, and he encourages that in him and instructs him, this is what you should say, but lets it be his. Stories, they do that. They bring out parts to us that we may not have thought about before. I wanted to tell my call story, and actually when Dave asked me to preach, he talked to me about that. And as I was working through this sermon, I was very anxious to do that. And so I wrote it all down. And I may read a little bit more during this time, partially to keep our time within the limits. But I grew up in a small town. My parents met at a Bible college and began a ministry together in central Illinois. My dad was a pastor, a youth pastor first, and then a lead pastor at a church for 20 years. So I grew up in this community of faith. My entire childhood was spent with the same congregation as my dad as the minister there. And it was very formative for me. The people there were my extended family. My grandma and grandpa and the rest of my relatives lived far away. And so they were the ones who came to my birthday parties and went to my school plays and supported me as a child. And it was a wonderful way to be introduced to the love of God. Early on in my life, I decided to be baptized. In the tradition that I grew up in, you decide to be baptized. When you're ready, there's immersion. At the age of 10, I can remember vividly the day that I stood before that congregation and made a proclamation of my faith in Jesus, and I dedicated my life to Christian ministry. It was around that time that I would occasionally imagine what it would be like to be in ministry. I had, as a young child, snuck up to the pulpit and pretended to preach. I would use the little daily bread booklets that we had in the Norfax area. I occasionally joined my dad on hospital visits and watched as he served in the church. I grew and was very involved in music in my church, as well as mission trips and outreach opportunities in the youth group. And when I was in high school, my dad spoke with us all, letting us know that he was feeling a call to church planting. And he had a particular project. As a family, we got on board, and we enjoyed that process, although it uprooted me from that group of people. And when I left for college, it was a big step for me. But something had started to set in. I was very interested in theology and philosophy and ended up studying both. But the parameters of what I could do as a woman in ministry in the tradition that I was raised were different than what I had started to feel. I pushed up against the traditions of my family by them deciding to go to seminary. Why are you going to seminary? I was asked by many people. I came down on, it's an academic endeavor for me. Which it was. But it was not part of my equation to go to seminary as a process of ordination. I preferred an academic route. During that time, I walked the line between wanting to still be connected to the faith community and familial tradition that had been so important to my foundation and my understanding of God and love and family and community. And yet, I felt the pain of being different and pushing boundaries that, while maybe didn't exist in my own heart, definitely existed. I can remember in seminary listening to men stand up in class and state that women should not be in leadership in the church and not be ordained. Often they were people coming out of the same tradition that I had grown up in. I will make this caveat. My parents were very supportive. After seminary, I found an amazing thing, which I've talked about before up here, chaplaincy. I completed a CPE year. Chaplaincy training was like things finally coming together. At last, ministry and my gifts of pastoral care were married and working. It was wonderful. I responded to the work and learned a ton. I honed my skills as a chaplain. I learned about compassion, and I love the work. I still love the work. For the next 10 years, I did that work on and off, always sharing when asked, "What do you do?" I'm a chaplain. It was my identity. That line I walked worked, but it was between denominations, because as a chaplain, I could be on the fringe. And that was fine for me. My husband and I moved a lot. We went to a lot of different churches, a lot of different denominations. And every once in a while, that call would come to me through questions from my friends, people wondering why I went to seminary for academic reasons. But that was all on the back burner. I would, after all, if I stepped into that call, I would have to find a home. I would have to find a denomination. That's sort of the way these things work. And I love chaplaincy work. And I believe that our life is a compilation of callings. And I keep saying that I think that I love chaplaincy work because I don't think that abandoning things along the way necessarily has to be the case. I think that we can instead pick up different callings as we move through life. We arrived in Salem, Oregon from New York City after having 2 kids, another calling that I had no idea about. It too joins my story, makes me stronger and braver and more patient. We had a surprise with that. We realized after 2 pretty difficult pregnancies and births that it would be very risky for me to do that again. And so my picture of what it meant to be a mom and my calling in that changed a little bit. In Salem, we walked into our first United Methodist Church. We decided to go meet the pastor at a coffee hour, which always makes me a little nervous. It was Dan Pitney. He asked about our story. My husband shared about his work and where he came from, and I shared about my work and where I came from. And I will never forget that conversation. When I finished talking, Dan looked at me and said, "How can I help? How can you get connected? Can I talk to you about ordination?" It was one of the first times that a pastor heard my story and reached out, not just in interest, but in action. Being there and then being in Bend reopened some of the questions that I had pushed aside for a long time. When I got to Bend, I started working as a chaplain again. Once again, thinking it was good to just do something that I was called to and that I loved. I got my feet under me, but my spirit started to stir. I remember telling my husband that I felt a restlessness and I didn't know why. I had dipped in and out of finding out about the UMC process of ordination, and people had begun to ask me questions. My husband, my good friend, the leadership here. But it was aggravating me. I didn't want to deal with the emotion of making a choice. 2 things happened. One was that this faith community embraced me and my family. Dave and Shamiko asked me to share my gifts in ministry. You all loved my kids and my family. You brought out in me things that I could contribute. The second thing that happened was a surprise. All of this wonderful stuff was happening here at the church, and I was still becoming more and more frustrated. And I was frustrated that I couldn't just be content as a chaplain and a part of an active congregation. And I went for a run. And as I was running, I was praying. And I was saying, why now? After all this time, God, after all that we've been through, all the traveling, all the churches, all this stuff, why would I do this now? I have a job, happy, what's going on? Why now? And I got quiet finally after yelling. Because what happened in that moment, in that voice, was that I remembered my baptism. And it was as if the words kind of, in themselves, brought me through that whole long story, that compilation of things coming together. Then a process of discernment and need. I don't make quick decisions. Shaky confessions of this call to Shaniko and to Dave, friends and family. I began that process and have returned to work in the church. And here I am. And that's the story so far. So what can I encourage you with today? Remember your own call story. As a community of faith, we have a responsibility to help others listen to their life and to God. When the superintendent was here, we were sitting around in the meeting after, and someone said at our table, how powerful would it be if when people walked into this church, we said, who are you? How has God made you? What gifts do you bring? Instead of, oh, we're going to change everything. How powerful. I can name the people who have spoken into my life. Second, we must cultivate space to listen for the voice of God. It's trendy. People love mindfulness around here, meditation. They love nature. Still, sometimes it's hard. It's hard to get away from our phones and Netflix and work and kids. But it's important. And we have spiritual disciplines from our Christian tradition to draw from. Simplicity, scripture, prayer, silence. Dallas Willard writes, God's voice is more a matter of weight or impact, an impression made on our consciousness, a certain steady and calm force which communicates God's impact on our soul, our innermost being. It inclines us toward assent and even toward compliance. So a sense of divine authority is characteristic of the voice of God. And E. Stanley Jones says, the inner voice of God does not argue, does not try to convince you. It just speaks and is self-authenticating. If we don't listen, it's hard to know. At this point in the service, we're going to have some time to practice listening. I encourage you to think about your story. What is God calling you to now? What did God call you to before? We'll have a little bit of music and maybe even some silence. And we'll end that time with the transition talk.